Hi, everyone. Thank you, Ryan. Yes, my name's Shannon Webb. I get the pleasure of moderating our panel today and introducing our panelists. We have 4 esteemed guests, who you'll hear from. After they present, all 4 of them present, we'll have some time for question and answer. You can use the Q&A function and type your questions in there if you'd like. So our first panelist is Ellie Hartman. She is a senior scientist at UW Stout and was the grant manager for the Wisconsin Promise Project. She is actually now with the Wisconsin Department of Workforce Development, and she'll tell you about her current role as well as her work in Wisconsin Promise. We have Jessica Smith, who is the project director for Inclusive Transition Education and Employment Projects at UW-Whitewater. Alex Lena, who is an independent living consultant with Mid-State Independent Living Choices. And Leanne DeWalt, who is the director of the Wiseman Center, which is our university center for excellence in developmental disabilities at UW-Madison. So we'll start with Ellie Hartman. Ellie.
Thank you, Shannon. I'm going to share my screen here so we can pull this up. Let's see here. Here we go. There we go. All right. Yes, so I was the project manager for Wisconsin Promise and previously the evaluator for what's called Let's Get to Work Wisconsin. I'm going to talk about both of those projects. Currently, my role with the Department of Workforce Development is with an integrated data system looking at impact of services and systems, including employment-related services for people with disabilities, youth and adults. So that's my new current role, but a lot that all builds on what I've learned through these other programs. So putting today's discussion into context, why think about this today with everything else going on? We know that people with disabilities are working in essential services today, and some of them may need that continued job support to continue to work and provide those essential services. We know individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities are working in grocery stores, they're working at your local Quick Trip, they're working in other essential services across the state. And so we know their independence and their work continues, just like ours, across the state. And so it's important to make sure that services and supports continue throughout. Another good reason is to utilize learning opportunities to maximize effective services and supports. So youth with disabilities, adults with disabilities can capitalize on work opportunities in an ever-changing environment. So now there are even with multitudes of job losses and temporary job losses with the social distancing policies, there's also an uptick in need for employers of essential services looking for people to fill those roles. And we know that people with disabilities bring a multitude of skills and abilities and really help fill job needs for employers across the state. And we'll talk more about that. And the other thing is, once the social distancing practices end, which will happen, at some point, we want to make sure that people with disabilities are considered for jobs as the economy switches back, right? Or in a new era with all the changes. And in the past, during recessions and things like that, people with disabilities are the last to be rehired, and we don't want that to be the case now. And so understanding what effective services and supports are available to help increase employment, and really recognizing the skills and abilities that people with disabilities can bring to the workforce is really important. It's not an afterthought. It's not a charity. It's people with disabilities definitely serve an essential role with our employers, and not to miss out on that opportunity, but also have the services and supports to help make that possible. And then finally, to recognize the supports and services that help make that possible. So as folks are talking about funding and policy and support for folks during this time, that it's recognized the services and supports for transition age youth and adults with disabilities as well, to help continue to support independent living and work in that transition age during high school, and then afterwards building that career and moving forward. So those are the reasons why today is a good reason to continue to talk about this and make sure that we're all thinking about those effective services and supports. So what I'm going to do is provide a background to research projects, policy-related projects around supporting transition age youth with disabilities, and what we found through those projects. So both of these projects were built on what's called the Guideposts for Success. And this is really a foundation found with youth transition projects that have occurred prior to these projects, really looking at those key aspects and how do you increase employment outcomes for transition age youth with disabilities. One is high expectations for all youth, including youth with disabilities. What we've found is as you start looking into adulthood and looking at career opportunities, it's not so much, okay, how can we overcome this disability? Yes, accommodations, services, supports are definitely helpful. But what we found is when you're starting to connect youth to employment opportunities, it's really looking at those skills and abilities. Do they have an attention to detail that's important? Are they consistently there with a smile on their face? Is there a certain skill or interest that is definitely needed within the company? And as you start to look, and each and every person has different pieces that they can bring every day, that when you start to look at those pieces, you can start to connect and see the value folks bring. And so I'm just going to tell you a quick story from Promise to highlight that. We had one youth and mom who entered the Promise project, which aim was to increase employment for people with disabilities. And mom was actually hesitant and kind of wishing she ended up in the group that didn't get the enhanced services. And what we did is we set up kind of like an enhanced job shadow where the youth got to try some things out at the local library. And when he did that and did a couple different tasks that they asked him to do, tried some things out, mom was present as well. And she recognized that he had more ability than she had anticipated. And she's like, oh, he can get a job. He can bring value, to this library, to other places similar to this library. And started to see that not only can he work, but he can be more independent than she thought. And then she started to think, okay, maybe he's not going to be completely dependent on me in adulthood. I can start thinking about my career. And she started going back into her, finishing up her accounting degree. And so changing that mindset and increasing those expectations is a big deal. The other is equality of opportunity for everyone, making sure that that there are the same opportunities for people with disabilities than those without. So inclusion, integration, recognizing the value of being part of the community, both from the individual standpoint, but for as the community standpoint as well. Full participation through self-determination, really listening to the individual's interests, choices, what do they want to do, makes a huge difference. If you want to make change, if you want to increase independence, then you start making decisions and you start sharing what and how you want to do that. And when you do that, you actually see more independence, more increase in ability. So that's a huge part. Talked about independent living as being an important part in that competitive in employment, looking at economic self-sufficiency. So looking at the income coming in, building assets, not settling for poverty level income, but really building with income and other supports, not only to increase the income overall, but assets and more economic self-sufficiency. And then the individualized, person-driven, and culturally and linguistically appropriate transition planning. So how are we supporting that transition moving forward? And all that's done through effective school preparation, youth development and leadership, career preparation, those connecting activities, and family involvement, which we'll talk about as well. And this all comes from the National Collaborative on Workforce and Disability. So the first project I want to talk about was, both of these were federal grants. This one is from the Administration of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, or AIDD. And this was a partnership and employment grant. And in Wisconsin, we called that Let's Get to Work. It was a series of school pilots. So we worked directly with the schools and individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. A little over 60 youth participated and their families. And really the idea was, can we increase transition planning in schools with supports of coaching, connecting to vocational rehabilitation, and other services and supports, and help that inform policy. What we learned in the schools, can we build on that? And what we found is the 5 C's were essential. So coordination of transition services, looking at that coursework to make sure it's more integrated, not only the coursework itself, but extracurriculars, looking at college access, self-directed career goals, community internships and jobs to gain work experience. We find that if one, and actually even more so, preferably at least 2 paid work experiences in the community predict work into adulthood. So having those opportunities while still in high school. And then collaboration was big. Okay, so across students, families, a variety of community members, and across the service system. And I provided a link here. It's letsgettoworkwi.org, and there's more information on this project. I mentioned 62 transition age youth. They were 14 to 18, had intellectual and or developmental disabilities. They were identified by the schools, around 5 youth per school. And what we were able to show across the project is, in the school system and with partnership with vocational rehabilitation and others, increases in services in self-determination, and that those career goals, collaboration, those integrated classes and extracurriculars, providing those community work experiences, post-secondary education supports, and coordination. And with those increases of services, we also saw increases in outcomes. So we saw youth more in more inclusive classes, they filled out a questionnaire either on their own or with support, and they reported higher quality of life, increased self-determination, so more control over their life, and more paid community work experiences, and their parents' attitudes and knowledge changed. So they had increased expectations, and they better understood how the transition services system worked. So that was Let's Get to Work. After Let's Get to Work, we utilized those lessons learned in the Wisconsin Promise Project. It was another federal grant. This one was a little different, and it was a research demonstration grant. So there was a treatment group who received promise services and a control group who received services as usual. It was a larger study. So we worked with over 2,000 youth, half in that promise services group, half in the usual services group. And they were 14, 15, and 16 when they entered. The criteria is a little different. So youth were receiving supplemental security income, SSI, and we also worked with the families. The disability, because it was any youth receiving SSI, the types of disability varied. So about a third of our population did have intellectual or developmental disabilities, but another third mental health related disabilities, and then a smaller percentage of other types of disabilities such as speech and language, ADHD, sensory, physical disabilities, long-term illness. So we had a wide variety of folks who participated in that study. And based on our learnings with Let's Get to Work and also the requirements of the grant, Wisconsin Promises services were provided through our Division of Vocational Rehabilitation with interagency resource teams. So making sure we pulled in the school partners, long-term care, mental health, sometimes foster care, depending on the needs of the youth and the support across systems. And we provided those services for at least 2.5 years. And those services included, that key one was those employment services, looking to get at least one paid job, preferably two, while still in high school. Work incentive benefits counseling. So they were on SSI talking about, okay, if you're working, what does that mean for benefits? How can you maximize income but still get the services and supports needed, especially thinking about healthcare? And as students, there's a thing called student earned income exclusion that allows a lot of youth to work without any issues of impact on benefits. But we were also talking to family members about working, and so those conversations got more involved when we did that. Financial coaching. So are we also asset building? Are we, what are we doing with that money? Are we able to save it? On the job social skills training. So those soft skills, communication, leadership, professionalism among them, teaching those as part of the pre-employment transition services, family and self-advocacy training, again, increasing that self-determination, and some health promotion. And what we found again was increased in employment rates. And this time with the randomized control trial, we can compare that to the control group. And we saw 10% more youth who got paid employment during the project compared to that control group. And if you look at the control group who never connected to VR, that gap widened even more. So about 2/3 of our youth got paid employment during the project. And that actually, the percentage actually continued to increase even after the project. So we built a good foundation. And some of those youth were even earning what's called substantial gainful activity at the end of the project. We found that interagency team to be essential. So when a school person was on the interagency team, that employment rate was even higher at 70%. And then looking specifically at youth enrolled in long-term care, so they might have intellectual developmental disabilities or physical disabilities, much more, a higher percentage with that intellectual developmental disabilities, who also need long-term care supports. And looking at their employment rates, and again, we saw differences. So with the control group, less connected to the long-term care system, and we saw a lower employment rate of about 43% who connected to paid employment during the project. Compared to treatment, we were able to connect more youth to those long-term service supports, and a higher percentage of them found paid employment during the project, 57%. And again, when we connected to that service system and it was part of that resource team, we saw an increase in employment rate. So when we identified the case manager from long-term care as part of the resource team, the employment rate increased to 71%. So what were those essential transition services? Looking at school services, those included youth apprenticeship, work experiences, job exploration, post-secondary supports, actually connecting the youth with the military, and time management training were all related to both employment and education outcomes. From the VR service side, job search assistance, trial work experiences, work-based learning, short-term job supports, and transportation supports. And from the promise specific services, those were the soft skills training, network incentive benefits counseling, financial capability building, health literacy training, and having a savings account identified. All those services were related to those positive outcomes that we saw. A couple lessons learned with youth receiving SSI. They are eligible because the family has lower income. And so we found a lot of supports, making sure that we recognize that our support systems are cumbersome to access, and sometimes poverty can get in the way. So living day to day makes it difficult to jump through all the required hoops of needing services, plus priorities like food and shelter, other things that are coming up in life sometimes follow through isn't what is expected sometimes in our service systems, and we need to be more accommodating based on youth and family need, giving living situations. And so we found we needed to be more trauma informed, recognize the basic needs that youth and families need, and making sure to connect it to resources and supports around those. Attending to ambivalence. So some folks are on the fence. Should I work? Shouldn't I? There's so much going on. How do we attend to where they want to go and how they want to get there, and not based on our thoughts and ideas, but based on theirs. Looking at training structure, make sure it's more hands-on practical for today versus long-term, because when your basic needs are an important piece, you need something that can impact today and help today. And in that sense, truly meeting the youth and family where they're at, and then building on that versus trying to dive into things at a different point. Once you meet the youth and family where they're at and build from there, we had a lot more success. And then some interagency lessons learned. So when we're providing services where the youth are at, looking at in the schools, of course that has to be part of the individual education program or IEP. Locally in the library, close by, obviously right now more virtually, but really helping provide services where they're at, utilizing the understanding what technology they have and utilizing that. I'll talk about a little bit more about that in a second. And then collaboration across the planning. So across the IEP and the individual plan for employment and the long-term care plan, if that's a piece as well. Building capacity with our providers for customized and supported employment. So providers provide ways to customize employment, support employment, and are we providing the structure, the funding and support needed for those services to be possible when needed. improve the service delivery and accessibility for SSI youth and their family members, and then utilizing technology. So we provided iPads and tablets for all our participants to access, and we even provided data plans for a while, although we found Wi-Fi was actually more dependable sometimes than the data plans themselves. And we also recognized that a lot of youth and families communicated through texting and things like that. And so maybe looking at the different technologies that youth or family are using and are most useful, and mobile with the youth and family, and making sure to connect youth with technology needed to be more and more independent. So whether that's a device or other assistive technology, it is also an important piece, and making sure, so sometimes youth have that through the school, but do they have that beyond school? And so because all our youth were connected to Voc Rehab, sometimes that's something they purchased as part of their employment plan. And making sure that we're increasing independence and accessibility during services and beyond, as youth become more independent, was another key piece of Promise. And I also have a website here, promisewi.com. You can go directly there, or promisewi.com/success. And that includes all our stats, linked to our videos. So we have videos of youth and family members sharing their stories. And we also have a longer video, a 2-hour video of from the counselor perspective, a mom's perspective, a youth's perspective, a variety of partner perspectives, Voc Rehab, that you can more information on the research, all in this 2-hour session. If you're really interested and want to learn more, a copy of that video is on that website as well.